Hello, my name is Dan Claw. I'm a rheumatologist at the University of Michigan, a faculty member in the Department of Anesthesiology. And I'm going to talk today posing the question, why are we still using so many opioids to treat chronic pain? You can see from my disclosure slide that I've testified against opioid manufacturers and distributors in the states of Oklahoma and Florida. As part of that testifying, we see internal documents at companies like Purdue that make it clear how they knew exactly what they were doing in broadening the use patterns for opioids. But a point of fact is that these drugs were never specifically approved by the Food and Drug Administration for the use in chronic pain. It was just over time a slowed gradual morphing of the labels of drugs, including oxycodone and hydrocodone, that led to these being more widely used to treat chronic pain. So I'm going to talk about a number of problems with opioids. The first is that the most widely used opioids, the pure mu opioids that are derivatives of hydrocodone or oxycodone, have really never been shown to be effective in parallel group randomized controlled trials for more than 12 weeks. The second problem I'm going to talk about is that these drugs cause a lot of side effects and a lot of harm. Most patients and providers think that the major side effect or problem with opioids is addiction and dependence, and those are an issue. But it's not the case that addiction occurs in chronic pain patients any more commonly than in the general population if someone's exposed to an opioid. The main problem I have with opioids are all the other things that people die of at much higher rates if they're taking an opioid. They get in much higher rates of suicide, motor traffic accidents, falls, myocardial infarctions. And because of this, the all-cause mortality, the risk of dying if a person with chronic pain is taking an opioid, is nearly double that of someone in the general population. So the third thing I'm going to talk about is that there's a lot of data now suggesting that opioids actually make pain intensity worse in a subset of individuals. And again, the emphasis here is not they don't make pain better, but they actually cause a statistical worsening of pain when people take opioids for a long period of time. And then finally, given all this, I think that any chronic pain patient that is taking an opioid should be encouraged to do a very slow, very gradual, self-directed taper to make sure they're benefiting from opioids before they continue to take all of these risks associated with opioid use in chronic pain. So first, talk a little bit about the studies and the meta-analyses that have been done with pure mu opioids. And again, now I'm talking about drugs like hydrocodone and oxycodone. Most of the meta-analyses lump together all opioids. So they'll lump together drugs like hydrocodone, oxycodone, with drugs like tapentadol or buprenorphine that are quite different. It's estimated that at least half of the analgesic efficacy of tapentadol comes from norepinephrine reuptake inhibition. Buprenorphine is both an opioid agonist and an antagonist. And some of the beneficial effects of buprenorphine clearly come from the antagonist properties. And so it's not really appropriate to lump these drugs together. They're really quite different with respect to their mechanism of actions. And it is the case that most of the studies of pure opioids, of hydrocodone and oxycodone, were either using enriched randomized withdrawal designs where individuals were first put on an opioid and then only those who benefited were randomized come off the opioid. These drugs like oxycodone and hydrocodone have not been subjected to parallel group classic design randomized controlled trials for more than 12 weeks. But the problem is, at present, these opioids are highly used. So in the condition fibromyalgia, where practice guidelines forever have said, don't use opioids, these individuals do not benefit from opioids. We are worried that these individuals may be made worse by giving them an opioid. That in the United States, about 40% of fibromyalgia patients are either taking oxycodone or hydrocodone. Again, these are not approved for use in chronic pain. They're used in chronic pain, but they never have undergone the kind of randomized controlled trials, parallel group design, then showing long-term effectiveness that other classes of drugs had to go through before they started to be used. Drugs like duloxetine or cyclobenzaprine or pregabalin, again, all have those kinds of trials. This is a review article I wrote several years ago in the journal Pain. It was actually commenting on a longer review that was written by Mark Sullivan and Jane Ballantyne, pointing out some of the potential problems with opioids that occur because you're giving someone a drug, an exogenous drug, that actually works by hijacking an endogenous system, the endogenous opioid system, that yes, the endogenous opioid system does help control pain in humans, but there's a lot of other functions in the endogenous opioid system. And when you give someone a high dose of an opioid, it shuts down the function of the endogenous opioid system so that the endogenous opioid system is not functioning the way that it should. People can't feel joy or pleasure from the release of endogenous opioids because they're drowning in oxycodone or hydrocodone. And again, this is one of the problems with giving someone an opioid is even if they don't become addicted to the opioid, they often become physiologically dependent on the opioid, and that causes its own set of problems. In conditions like fibromyalgia, we're particularly concerned that opioid use may actually make the pain worse and make the condition worse. This is a study done by our group where in fibromyalgia patients, we used both functional MRI and PET imaging with carfentanil, which is a highly potent opioid. And in this study, it looked as though in the brain regions that were most abnormal in fibromyalgia patients with respect to pain processing, that there was over-release of endogenous opioids, again, in PET imaging using carfentanil. And in that article, we said it looked like fibromyalgia was an example of endogenous opioid-induced hyperalgesia, that the endogenous opioids that people were releasing, the endorphins and enkephalins, at high levels over long periods of time, actually led to the phenomenon called opioid-induced hyperalgesia that we have demonstrated repeatedly in animal and human studies that opioid administration can, over time, make pain worse rather than make it better. And some of the meta-analyses have tried to look both at pure mu opioids as well as mixed opioids as well, and then long-term studies versus short-term studies. And the longer you use an opioid, the less you can show benefit with respect to pain relief. Again, most of the studies have been 4 to 8 weeks with the pure opioids, and most of the studies that were done longer were with the mixed opioids. And again, the pure mu opioids, more often than not, were studied using these randomized withdrawal designs, where it was only the mixed opioids where there were longer trials using parallel group designs that made the overall findings of the meta-analyses suggest there might be some benefit for long-term use. But again, that benefit was never shown with drugs like oxycodone and hydrocodone. The second big point I want to make is that what I really worry about when someone is taking an opioid for chronic pain is not addiction, but rather all-cause mortality, because we know all-cause mortality can be up to double in any given year for a chronic pain patient taking opioids. And again, the problem that we see with all-cause mortality, it's not just overdose deaths that occur at an increased frequency in people with chronic pain taking an opioid. They seem to die at higher rates from suicide, from motor traffic accidents and other types of accidents like falls, as well as myocardial infarctions. There's a whole set of side effects, deadly side effects that occur more frequently when someone's on an opioid. And this significant increase in all-cause mortality is concerning, especially since, again, in many of these individuals, they're not in any way benefiting from the opioid. So there's a number of studies that have looked at this and have concluded that this really is a problem, that there is a direct causal effect on mortality through prescribing an opioid to an individual. And many studies have shown this. This particular study suggested that the odds ratio or mortality risk when confined to out-of-hospital deaths was nearly double, or 2.12. Other studies have suggested odds ratios of 1.5 to 2.0. But again, study after study after study has shown that there's an increase in mortality in people that are given an opioid for chronic pain. This is a study that shows that some of those other studies may actually even be underestimating opioid-related mortality rates, because some of these individuals that are dying of an opioid on death certificates may be misclassified, because, again, they had a condition that their death was attributed to, rather than someone saying, oh, maybe that was the opioid that caused their death. There is a very real possibility that opioids made pain worse in a subset of patients. I know of only 2 long-term trials of opioid therapy. Neither of these intentionally looked at people for an entire year, but both of these really showed, in a scary way, that this hypothesis that opioids may actually make pain intensity worse compared to non-opioid analgesics when given for a long period of time. There's good evidence for this occurring, and there's no evidence that this doesn't occur. Again, I only know of 2 long-term studies that I'll show here, again, both of which showed that the individuals that were randomized to the opioid versus the non-opioid therapy had statistically worse pain intensity at 1 year compared to the individuals who got the non-opioid analgesics. And before I show you these data, anytime people have seen I am involved in a lot of research. Every data set that I've ever looked at, every cross-sectional data set that I've ever looked at of any chronic pain condition shows that the people who are getting opioids are statistically worse in almost every way than the people who don't get opioids. But we've always said, well, this just could be confound by indication. It could be that the people with worse pain are the ones that get the opioids, and that's why they look worse in cross-sectional studies. Well, in contrary, it could be that they actually make pain worse. And again, there are a couple studies that suggest this might be occurring. The first study is the so-called SPACE trial, the first author being Aaron Krebs, a really nice study. In the main outcome of the study that was used as the primary outcome was pain interference. And you can see in the first part of the outcomes, the primary outcome, pain-related function, was actually no different in the individuals who were randomized to receive an opioid versus a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug and or acetaminophen. But if you look very carefully at the data, the pain intensity actually got statistically worse. That was not the primary outcome, but if it was the primary outcome, the pain intensity would have been statistically worse in the group of people that received the opioid versus the group of people that did not receive the opioid. And again, in this study, you can see that the opioid-treated people are worse in every conceivable way with respect to physical functioning and a number of other measures. This is not just pain intensity that get worse in individuals with opioid. And this graph here, again, shows at 52 weeks that the opioid-treated individuals have a statistically higher pain intensity than the individuals that were randomized to get nonsteroidals and acetaminophen. And there was another recent study where opioids were given short-term. It showed the exact same thing, where when they looked at 1 year, this was hidden in the back, in a figure in the back. When they looked at the 1 year of the people for acute pain that were giving an opioid versus a non-opioid, the group that got randomized to receive an opioid had a statistical increase in pain intensity at 1 year. And so I say to people, this should be a cortical tattoo when you're thinking about prescribing an opioid newly, or when you're encountering this patient with chronic pain that is on an opioid therapy, that there's a significant chance that this opioid has actually made their pain worse over time. And now the issue is, what can or should I do about this? And again, I think that because of all of what I said, that everyone that is taking an opioid for chronic pain should be encouraged by providers to do a very slow, very gradual, self-directed taper to make sure that they're benefiting from an opioid. Because if they don't do that, they don't know if they're one of the people who actually are helped by an opioid um, versus one of the individuals whose pain is being made worse by opioids. Because we know that in opioid taper studies, there are a significant number of individuals that find after they taper their opioids, their pain either doesn't change or their pain gets better. And again, when individuals are encouraged and then do taper their opioids, they almost always feel a lot better with respect to the side effect profile. And a lot of individuals don't even remember until they're tapered off the opioids that their memory was a lot better, that they had a lot more energy when they were off the opioid than when they are on the opioid. So how do you get your patients to consider tapering? The first is, I joke when I'm teaching individuals, you can't play checkers, you have to play chess, and you have to think of this as a multi-step process where what you might do over a series of visits is give your patients factoids aimed to convince the patient that they might want to consider tapering. Some of the things you may ask them is, are you aware that some recent studies have shown the significant increased risk of death just associated with opioid use, that this just doubles your risk of dying in the next year? Are you aware that many people who have good initial effects of opioids and do have improvement in their pain short term, when they take those drugs for long periods of time, we see that their pain actually gets worse and worse, and that there are studies that suggest that the longer you take an opioid, that it not only does it reduce the likelihood that it's helping pain, but it increases the likelihood that it's actually making your pain worse. And then again, tell people that that if your pain does get worse when you taper your opioid, you should continue to take the opioid. But our concern is that if you have never tried to slowly, gradually taper your opioid, you won't know if it's helping you or not. Another thing that's helpful to say to patients is that we are learning, in the US in particular, where we prescribe a lot of drugs, that opioids are one of many classes of drugs that are overprescribed and that there are benefits of de-prescribing. In the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of classes of drugs, benzodiazepines, anti-epileptics, a lot of different drugs. The US drug companies are very good at doing the trials that tell us when to put people on drugs, but they don't do trials to tell us when to take people off drugs. It's not in their best interest to tell us when we can take people off of drugs. And so there's a lot of classes of drugs, especially and including opioids, that are overprescribed, and that now we're trying to think of strategies to de-prescribe these drugs to see who's really continuing to benefit from them. Never force a taper. We know that's dangerous. That happened with the initial CDC guidelines that were unfortunately weaponized. And so people should never be forced to taper. As a provider, you should only really be trying to convince your patient it might be in their best interest to taper, because forced tapers don't work and often do make people worse. And then finally, focus on dose reduction, not elimination. It's not really important that people entirely come off the opioids. Dose reduction will lead to harm reduction. And we know that a lot of the side effects of opioids can be mitigated against just by simply lowering the dose. It also is true, just like, for example, when you're trying to get someone off of long-term corticosteroid therapy, like drugs like prednisone, that because these drugs act by working on an endogenous hormone system, it's really hard to get people entirely off of the drugs because they often go through a bit of withdrawal, whether it's steroid withdrawal or opioid withdrawal. Whereas you can get them down to a very low dose of the drug before they actually go through that last bit of withdrawal, that is due to the fact that it might take their endogenous opioid system a while to become active again after they've been on exogenous opioids for such a long period of time. And finally, this makes sense, but it often is helpful that when you're trying to get people to taper their opioids or any therapy that you think might not be beneficial, that at that same time, you may want to add a new therapy, especially one of the many non-pharmacologic therapies that we know can be especially helpful in people with chronic pain. Thank you.